Very good. Hi, everyone. People are still coming in, but we're starting this event, which is the book lounge. And I'm Hannah Oulman, and I'm a training analyst at the Tel Aviv Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And I'm very, very pleased to open this evening the launching of the book, The Most Innovative Ideas in Psychoanalysis, Originality, Development, Progress, edited by Goברין and John Mils. First, I wish to thank Tel Aviv Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis, and in particular, the Scientific Committee and Gadit Orian for helping to organize this event and providing the platform for all of us. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. The book Innovative Ideas in Psychoanalysis that we're launching tonight is an extraordinary attempt to cover new developments in psychoanalysis, current thinking, and cutting-edge ideas in the wild field that psychoanalysis has become. As early as 1988, Wallerstein has argued that psychoanalysis is not one, but many. This is even more evident today that the various schools of analytic thought have become ever more productive and creative. And we have become more accustomed to appreciate the value of this very multiplicity. This book challenges us to enter a dialogue with difference, a dialogue where the other perspective is appreciated for what it can uniquely contribute to our own. Reading through the chapters of the book is an opportunity to disturb a balance and prevent stagnation. The contributors to the book were asked by Anel and John, what are the most important developments in psychoanalysis today, and what impact has your chosen perspective had on conducting psychoanalytic treatment? Their answers outline creatively unsettling and pluralistic tensions, both between the schools of psychoanalysis and depth psychology, and also within each of the main schools. The book covers in one volume well-known classical and contemporary schools, such as Freudian, Kleinian, Lacanian, self, intersubjective, Kohut, and relational. But it also includes altogether new developments, such as neuropsychoanalysis, empirical research on addiction and substance abuse, and a chapter on using remote treatments in psychoanalysis as recently forced on us. In so doing, the book also invites us to reflect on the very question of tradition versus innovation. Are there boundaries to the psychoanalytic tradition? Can all of these innovations live together, like in a big tent? Or when does an innovation stray too far from the title psychoanalytic? And what do we consider an innovation in the first place? These are some of the questions that we will hear about from our speakers tonight. While Freud had to guard against innovations that seemed to contradict claims important to him to protect the nascent school of thought that he just invented, psychoanalysis now is perhaps influential and robust enough to risk innovations and heterogeneity. Still, the question is a complicated one. How do we rely on the tradition and on our ancestors who created it without letting them haunt us as ghosts? In this respect, this is a courageous book. It announces that innovations are here, both within and outside the well-known schools of psychoanalysis, and shows their productivity, challenging us to stretch the boundaries of our traditions without abandoning them. In a way, the book gives us an opportunity for, in the words of Philip Bromberg, staying the same while changing. We will hear today 4 speakers, the co-editors of the book, Goברין and John Mils, and 2 of the contributors to the book, Rachel Blas and Steve Kocuk. While they will speak, you are welcome to write your comments on chat, and I will do my best to pick up any questions or thoughts that you have and bring them to the speakers. We will take a few minutes after each talk for any thoughts or questions that you may have. But now I'm very pleased to introduce our first speakers, whom we all know. Goברין is a clinical psychologist and director of the doctoral program Psychoanalysis and Hermeneutics in the Department of Hermeneutics and Cultural Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Goברין has authored numerous publications, including 4 books, Between Abstinence and Seduction, The Analysis of American Psychoanalysis, Conversations with Michael Eigen, Conservative and Radical Perspectives on Psychoanalytic Knowledge, The Fascinated and the Disenchanted, and Ethics and Attachment, How We Make Moral Judgments. That's the last one in 2018. Aner maintains a private practice in Tel Aviv and is a member of the Tel Aviv Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis, and currently also the co-chair of the Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy program at the Institute. Aner's title is, What is a Psychoanalytic Innovation? בבקשה, אנר.
Thank you, Hannah. Does psychoanalysis progress? And if so, what does progress in our field mean? So my discussion today, my discussion today has 2 parts. First, I will explain why psychoanalysis does change. And then in the second part, I will try to characterize a psychoanalytic innovation. So please put the first slide on. You can see here the PEP statistics for the past 5 years, the most 30 cited papers on the list. If you can see, these papers were published between 1935 and 1992. Many of them are from the 40s or 30s. Only 2 of them out of the 30 are from the early 2000s. And so the majority of the best read and the best cited psychoanalysis papers are no longer alive. Klein, Ferenczi, Bion, Rosenfeld, Winnicott, Stretchy, Betty Joseph. So the list of dead authors might tempt one to draw the sad conclusion that psychoanalysis is a community that goes on celebrating the achievements of the past, and that none of the articles written since have had a comparable impact to the cherished canonical text written up to roughly the mid-80s. Indeed, critics of psychoanalysis comment negatively on its tendency to dwell on the past. You can see here a citation from Bornstein and Messling noted that a geneticist of 1900 could not sustain a conversation with a contemporary geneticist, but Freud would have no trouble recognizing the psychoanalysis of 1997 or reading a modern psychoanalytic journal. And I think it's true even for today. So this criticism was often heard in academic psychology, mistakes, I think, the essence of psychoanalysis, because psychoanalytic innovation is not like scientific discovery. It does not reveal new facts which then replace earlier facts. The criticism fails to bring into account that psychoanalysis is a language that deciphers meaning, generate insights about the psyche, insights that inspire other insights. So psychoanalysis is more similar to philosophy and to literature than to science. University departments of philosophy around the world teach ancient Greek philosophy all the way to the philosophy of the modernity, like Spinoza or Kant or Hegel, to mention just a few. And these philosophers continue being read because the depths of their insights transcends historical periods and the relevance does not diminish. The same goes for literature. Raviel Netz in 2016 provides an illustration from the field of papyrology, papyrus. In 1896 in Egypt, thousands of decaying papyrus scrolls were discovered. Scholars were excited. New texts and new books in the literature of ancient Greece were about to be discovered, and they believed the study of antiquity was about to undergo a profound change. So what happened? Here and there, indeed, an ancient papyrus carrying a hitherto unknown text was found, but such incidents were rare. By far, the most discovered scrolls were manuscripts of texts we already knew, the same Plato again, and the same Homer. It transpired that literary taste does not tend to change. Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides were Athens' most popular playwrights, even in their own lifetimes, and they remained so for the next 2,500 years. So, insights concerning the psyche, likewise, do not lose their relevance rapidly. Truths of this type go on being discovered by one generation after another. This type of innovation might be captured more by the notion of wisdom as opposed to discovery, which casts a new light on mental life. And much like in the case of philosophy, these ideas become the source of inspiration for new ideas, which in turn will multiply. So analysts reread classical reference and adapt Freudian or Kleinian or Winnicottian methods to contemporary clinical fields. And if you can show the next slide, that innovation comes through interpretive extension. Now, I want to show you two citations from one from a philosopher of science and another one from a poet that illustrate the connection between tradition and innovation in non-psychoanalytic fields. You can show them here, the slide. So first we have the Thomas Kuhn writes on scientific revolution that the revolution requires a thoroughgoing commitment to the tradition with which the fully successful innovator eventually breaks. And T.S. Eliot wrote, "The poem which is absolutely original is absolutely bad. It is, in the bad sense, subjective, with no relation to the world to which it appeals." Okay, so I want to move now to part two, and thinking about what characterizes a psychoanalytic innovation. And I have found four characteristics of a psychoanalytic innovation. The first one is that most innovations concern new psychic dynamics linking between transference, psychopathology, and infants' mental life. So if you look at these 30 canonical texts, the 30 most cited articles and viewed paper written by Klein and Bion and Winnicott and other prominent figures, this is actually the psychoanalytic canon. it goes on to inspiring new work, and this prompts us to consider what is about these inspirational sources that leads to innovative production. So we can observe here a common factor, a common pattern, that almost without exception, they tie together the three following domains: development, psychopathology, and therapy. The specific psychoanalytic approach of the paper in question does not seem to matter. It can be self-psychology or Klein or Winnicott or Ferenczi. The patient's psychopathology always appears in relation to the transference, and the transference is always related to early interaction with the caregiver. So canonical papers, it appears, all present the regularities at work between these same components again and again with different variation. And just as a problem in biology is solved in terms of biology, not in those of chemistry, a psychic fact is understood in this particular psychoanalytic way. This way of thinking has not altered since Freud and is in fact a variation on Freud's transference neurosis, namely the idea that the patient's early childhood conflicts resurface in the transference relationship with the psychoanalyst. So innovation always tied together in a new ways these three domains. Second, psychoanalytic innovation solves empirical problems. And this is a very important factor in the innovation, that psychoanalysis is actually a psychology. It addresses clinical phenomena. It addresses first-order facts. These facts that they try to explain, the psychoanalysts, are independent of theory. Yes, that, for example, patients suffering from hysterical symptoms visited Freud's clinic. He had no idea what might be wrong with them. He have identified hysteria as a clinical phenomenon. And now through this, he was able to discover the unconscious, the various other mental structures, and eventually to develop his overarching theory. The philosopher of science, Larry Loudon, argues that science fundamentally aims at the solution of empirical problem. An empirical problem, he argues, is anything about the natural world which strikes us as odd or otherwise in need of explanation. Empirical problems in psychoanalysis may be a 3-year-old's fixation on her doll, intense destructive jealousy, dreams. Notice that all these phenomena exist in the world as they are. They are not related to psychoanalytic theory. So what psychoanalysts do best is to take an unexplained clinical phenomena, often a puzzling one, and clarify it, contextualize it in a way that it does not seem puzzling anymore. Third, psychoanalytic innovations are formulated poetically. But the new knowledge, this explanation, is not communicated as if it was, say, medical knowledge. Often texts in this domain seem vague, open to interpretation, hard to understand. It seems it is read more like poetry in its formulation. In typical texts by Bion, Ogden, Winnicott, or Eigen, sentences are often ambiguous and labyrinthine. Meaning is dense and layered, the opposite of the clear and simple style that scientists admire. Often the reader, in addition to gaining new knowledge, has an aesthetic experience, which involves powerful emotional intensities. The text seems to resonate deep layers with which the reader now makes contact for the first time. Canonical texts, in this sense, offer an enigmatic, complex phenomena demanding explanation in its own right, like poetry. So most of the major psychoanalysts are rather gifted writers, and their texts may resemble literary prose or poetry more than properly scientific texts. But, and this is an important but, psychoanalytic thinking is not poetry. and the poet has somewhat different motivations from that of the analyst who uses words to describe the psyche, although the two may at times overlap. The aim of the poem is not to convince readers of the correspondence of words to reality. Rather, its purpose is to facilitate readers to imagine the world as the poet depicts. Now, although poetic truth of this kind is not alien to psychoanalytic writing, it does seem to differ from it in some important sense. Think about the author of psychoanalytic texts. They all want first and foremost to understand an unknown psychic fact, an empirical problem. The innovative analyst has just, for example, met a patient. The patient suddenly behaves in a strange way or reacts in somewhat awkward way. The analyst is puzzled. She feels that she cannot rely on current theories. She's holding a curious, not knowing position, until she discovers an interesting, innovative explanation. She knows that her description must correspond to the psychic reality out there in the transference relations, and that she cannot imagine it or make it up like a poet. So she's fully committed to something to which the poet is only loosely committed, namely to understand what it was that happened there, both in the past and in the present. So all psychoanalytic writings displays this tension. It's scientific writing, aims at solving empirical problems. That's what we do in science. It is scientific writings is disciplined, it's clear-cut, it tells us how to think, it is systematic, it aims at solving profound mysteries and riddles. Poetic writing is undisciplined, unpredictable, and full of subjectivity, but it is also passionate and spontaneous, seeking rather what Bolas calls psychic intensities. We need both, as they seem to empower each other, creating a certain energy that outweighs their separate meaning and impact. And fourth, the last one, is that psychoanalytic innovations conceptualize what we already know. So there is another sense in which innovation is science, is unlike innovation in psychoanalysis. While new knowledge concerning a scientific problem reveals what we did not know earlier, psychoanalysis, like art, adds meaning to what we already knew. We can, in other words, regard psychoanalytic writing as a type of symbolic writing, insofar as it takes an existing experience to which we had no verbal access and makes it accessible. Something we experience without being aware acquires now articulate meaning. Both Meltzer and Bion emphasize that psychoanalysis has not discovered any new ideas about its subject, the human mind, and that it is unlikely to do so. But through the psychoanalytic method, old ideas can be rediscovered in a new context. Freud writes, "I find myself for a moment in the interesting position of not knowing whether what I have to say should be regarded as something long familiar and obvious, or something entirely new and puzzling," end of quote. The poetic language functions like a muscle that supports its approach to the truth. It elicits a powerful emotional engagement with the newly discovered facts. We have experienced this knowledge, but it was unconceptualized so far. For the discovered facts to ring true, the poetic quality of the text is crucial. A word is always an experiential memory. So overall, in conclusion, I think that regarding first order question, psychoanalysis is in a good position. In fact, I believe psychoanalysts' merit is exactly in its ability to find effective explanations to significant psychic phenomena and clinical facts, which are different from the psychoanalytic theories, which attempts to solve them. So psychic phenomena are therefore the engine behind psychoanalytic progress and innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aner, for this really, really beautiful and lucid description of psychoanalysis, both as a science and as a poetic enterprise, but one that aims to explicate and give meanings to psychic phenomena. And I think you were describing really the tension in our work, in psychoanalytic work, the tension between the poetic and the systematic, describing the meaning, discovering the meaning, and giving it, and putting it in, or seeing it in a new context. So, and I think your 4 criteria are really helpful in really describing innovations in psychoanalysis. We have one comment just saying that this was an
Anna, I would like to speak also. I don't know how to chat.
Ah, okay.
Do you hear me? I would like to speak. I don't know how to chat.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
But someone is before me, yes?
No, I just said that both, the 2 people just wrote that this was an excellent presentation, Anna.
Ah, okay.
So go ahead, Hani.
Okay, so Anna, thank you very much for beautiful introduction. It's really somehow summarized many of the questions that bother us. I just wanted to add that in the book Cogitations, Bjorn tried to solve this dilemma, and he tried to cope with this dilemma. And he asked, what is the difference between psychoanalysis and other fields? And he speak to the philosopher of science, to the philosophers of science, and they say to them that they rely on cognition and only on cognition. The scientific philosophers are based their ideas on cognition and cognition alone. And psychoanalysts cannot rely on cognition. And then he says, I would like to add the idea of intuition, that the psychoanalyst is based also on intuition. But what is intuition? It's so vague. So he says that we have to meet, we meet a lot of colleagues in groups, and we discuss, and then we have common sense. I find that my patient is doing some behavior like your patient, so we validate each other. But we must understand that the intuition is a very important part of the psychoanalytic thinking.
Okay, thank you, Hani. Yeah.
Very important comment. Thank you, Hani.
Yes. Yeah. Anyone else would like to comment before we move on? Let me just say that beyond the general things that you said, Daniel, I think that really your first criteria, in other words, describing the basic structure that we can find in every psychoanalytic tradition, which is linking of psychopathology, transference, and infant development. This is a basic structure that we can find in each psychoanalytic tradition. I think that's a very, very lucid and important structure that really describe psychoanalysis. Okay. So other people are writing that this was a very interesting and illuminating presentation. And we would like to move on to our next speaker, the co-author of this book, John Mils. John Mils is a philosopher, psychoanalyst, and clinical psychologist. He is a professor of psychology and psychoanalysis at Adler Graduate Professional School in Toronto, and he runs a mental health corporation in Ontario, Canada. He is a recipient of numerous awards for his scholarship, including 4 Gradiva Awards. He is the author or the editor of 22 books in psychoanalysis, philosophy, psychology, and cultural studies, including Inventing God, Underworld, Conundrums, a critic of contemporary psychoanalysis, Origins on the genesis of psychic reality, Treating attachment pathology, The Unconscious Abyss, Hegel's Anticipation of Psychoanalysis, and The Ontology of Prejudice. John will speak to us about innovation and tradition in psychoanalysis.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to speak informally because I will never be able to outdo Anir's excellent, profound scholarly presentation. Anir and I became friends when I first came to Israel in 2015 at a conference that critiqued my work. And we naturally were attracted to one another because we are both philosophers, in addition to psychoanalysts and clinical psychologists. So, doing a project together was important for me. And we also are interested in pluralism. And so one of the intentions behind the book was to engage all the different schools in psychoanalysis. And as a comparative scholar, I particularly have looked at all the schools. I've written on almost all of the schools. So we have some interesting chapters from many noted people, including more classical or post-classical theory. We start out by looking at what contemporary Freudians have to contribute. And this in particular is a chapter in modern conflict theory. So based on Brenner and Arlo's work and how it's applied today, we move into contemporary Kleinian thought. Then we also look at the Jungian school or post-Jungian thought. And then we move on to Lacan. And during all these, the Lacan in particular is a current contemporary innovations that have taken place in Quebec and Canada, and particularly by a group called Gefrique. And they treat young psychotic adults in outpatient therapy without the use of medication. And they've had great statistical achievements, and it's funded by the Canadian government. But all these main schools overlap with other types of movements, and particularly in philosophy. So we have a chapter on existential analysis, and then we shift gears and we try to introduce what contemporary developments are in neuroscience. We have then bringing up more into the 70s, we go back to Kohut and have a chapter on self-psychology, but from more relational developments. And then we have a chapter on contemporary relational theory. We also have the overlap with intersubjectivity and the use of phenomenology, but also how it's applied to ethics. And we have a chapter on more academic or empirical psychoanalysis. And this more or less takes personality theory, mainly from Sid Blatt's work, and applies it to addictions. And then we end the book with how to conduct psychoanalysis via teletherapy or video therapy, which is apropos given the pandemic and how most of us are treating our patients through this means. There were some omissions. One particular omission, I just couldn't really find a contributor, was modern psychoanalysis. Meaning the work of Spotnitz and Meadows, that's quite popular in New York. We could have focused a little bit more on specific analysts like Winnicott or Bion. So there are some, some missing parts or pieces. But for the most part, it really was a tribute to pluralism, to diversity, and to comparative, not necessarily integrative, but comparative thought. And I think for this reason alone, it's a very unique edited volume. I don't think you're going to find any other book out there like it that tries to celebrate the diversity of thinking. What I consider to be innovation is, I think, how do you take other disciplines and either apply it or critique it through a psychoanalytic lens? Because of my my interdisciplinary background, it's somewhat, I think, more natural for me to wear a few different hats at one time. So coming at things from a philosophical lens and applying it to a psychoanalytic model, or one could apply a psychoanalytic model to a philosophical problem or concept. But if I had the inclination, I could see that there would be many different types of innovative projects that one could attempt. You have theoretical, clinical, and applied psychoanalysis. You have three major branches with sub-branches within those. And depending upon your interest, if we're just looking at theory, but if you're interested in clinical work, you're bringing in certain theoretical orientations or sub-orientations into clinical work. You have a multitude of phenomenon to focus upon clinically that you could apply different models to it. Let's say, I don't know, you want to take the concept of projective identification, and you could apply it to society today, not just a clinical encounter. You could do a number of things that I think would be interesting in overlap in different areas. If you were to take the field of philosophy, keep in mind that psychology was always a part of philosophy. It was never segregated. During Aristotle's time, philosophy included everything, the natural world. It was only a modern invention that we started dividing off these disciplines into specific categories and into specific professions. So the overlap has always been in the background from an ancient point of view, but the modern world, let alone the contemporary world, sees things in very bifurcated categories, such as science, versus the humanities. When one could look at psychoanalysis as a human science or as a semiotic science, but the word itself is loaded. What is science? What do you mean by science? Right there, you have to define what we're talking about, so we have a common language of conceptualization. We need to understand distinctions between an explanandum versus an explanans, description versus explication or an explanation. meaning versus causality. The notion of philosophy is so broad, like if you take metaphysics and you apply it to psychoanalysis, you would start with, let's say, a simple bifurcation of realism versus idealism. But these import certain types of stances on what we think is real, what is ontology. And we form theories based upon these basic questions of what is real. And so is what is real something external to the mind? Is it independent of the mind? And are we studying the natural world? Do we discover objects that permeate our consciousness? Or does our mind structure reality? And the notion of essa in anima, or being in soul, or what we call psychic reality, that, these are such, incredibly interesting dialogues with different types of thinking that I'm actually trying to develop a theory, what I call psi world, where there's really no distinction between our psyche and worldhood, or being in the world. I'll let you know how that turns out. One thing that I think contemporary theorists, particularly the relational school, could do, if they're inclined to do, is develop a theory of postmodern psychoanalysis. Now, I myself am not a big fan of postmodernism, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't have value if someone were to radically question the concept of truth, the concept of reality, of meaning, of language. I mean, it's ripe for all kinds of interesting developments if one were inclined to do it, and particularly applied psychoanalysis. I mean, if we can't apply our theory to culture and to our social reality, to worldhood, then really we don't have much to offer. Because if we cannot offer that, which I believe psychoanalysis as a whole, with all these myriad schools of thought, it's the most complex psychological theory that exists over any other kind of psychological theory. Psychoanalysis, in my opinion, has more to offer. It just needs to be developed. And so I'm going to end by of saying that I think there's a great deal of new potential, minds to mine, and I hope to see some more creativity in our field and original writing. One could be applying psychoanalytic thought to aesthetics. We already see ethics as being a particularly more recent topic. We're even seeing how it's being applied to ecology or to our climate emergency. And my next book that I'm just completing is called End of the World. So I hope we're still around by 2050, and we're not, and we will still have more innovations to offer at that time. Thank you for having me.
Hannah?
Thank you very much, John. Yes, Gabi, you want to comment?
Yes. I was thinking in the context of Anel's and John's presentation, actually, how difficult it was to introduce changes into psychoanalysis. First of all, how Freud himself was very defensive at times. I was thinking about Winnicott's almost getting a heart attack in New York when he presented the use of the object, which was a radical change of the theory of aggression. I'm thinking about the late thinking of Bion
that was accepted with a lot of suspicion by the Kleinians, the O, for instance, the concept of O. I was thinking about Kohut's transformations of narcissism and cosmic narcissism, that nobody related to that except for Anna Freud, who related to that because it was similar to the idea of sublimation that her father wrote about. And in all these cases, there is first a total rejection of the innovation, and then later on, there is it filters into the thinking and it becomes useful. And then I wanted to just add one other innovation that at least I feel very close to, is the link between psychoanalysis and Buddhism. These are two theories that relate to human suffering. And we can see that Symington wrote about it, Eigen writes about it, Barry McGee writes about it, and of course some of us in Israel write about it, that actually Buddhism, as the most ancient theory of human, how to treat human suffering, can be used today psychoanalytically. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Gabi. And yeah, and thank you, John, for this very, very complex rendition of the directions in which psychoanalysis can still go. It is so, it's really mind-boggling to think about all the applied areas that you mentioned, and really demonstrate the complexity of the way when we think psychoanalytically. So thanks a lot. There was a question that came up in the comments before you spoke, John, but I still want to raise it now. And that is, what about the unconscious as an organizing principle of psychoanalysis? I guess, Amir, this is something that you may want to respond to in terms of the basic structure that we see in all the traditions of psychoanalysis. I think
Yes.
this is covered by transference, right?
Yes, I think the unconscious, what I talk about is the content of the three domains, that transference, psychopathology, and development. Unconscious has relation to all three of them. It's not content, it's process. So of course, it's something that is similar almost to every paper, innovative or not innovative, in psychoanalysis. The unconscious is very central to it, of course.
Yep. And well, I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the talk of our next speaker. We move on to our next two speakers who have contributed chapters to the book, outlining innovations within their own psychoanalytic school. And in a way, I think represent two poles in terms of the boundaries versus permeability, maybe, of the tradition of psychoanalysis. So we will, our next speaker is Rachel Blas. I'm very pleased to present Rachel, who is well known to most of us. She will speak about innovations in Kleinian theory. Rachel Blas is a training and supervising analyst at the Israel Psychoanalytic Society, a member of the British Psychoanalytic Society, and a professor of psychoanalysis at leading universities, both in the UK and in Israel. She is on the board of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, where she is the editor of the controversies section. She is currently in private practice in Jerusalem. She has published a book and over 80 articles which elucidate the foundations of psychoanalysis and their role in contemporary analytic thinking and practice. And she offers a close study of Freud's texts and evolution of his ideas, and clarifies how Kleinian psychoanalysis grounds and advances these ideas. She has lectured, taught, supervised, and offered clinical seminars in many countries, and her writings have been translated into 15 languages. So I'm pleased to welcome you, Rachel, and Rachel will speak to us about innovations in Kleinian theory. please. Rachel, are you there?
I need to unmute myself. Okay. I think I'm talking about not innovations in Kleinian analysis. I think I'm talking about innovations in psychoanalysis from a Kleinian perspective.
Okay. Thank you for correcting.
And there's a very significant difference there because it's how I see what innovation is in psychoanalysis from this perspective. I'm not talking about what has happened in my group. I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad that for Aner's invitation, both to be here and to contribute to the book. And I think it's a tribute to his true pluralism, that he invites someone who thinks so differently than he does in essential ways. And so we have a fruitful dialogue truly around their differences. It's not a great achievement for two pluralists and eclectic authors to speak together with each other. It's when there's a foundational difference that it's the task of maintaining a pluralistic dialogue requires more. So I'm thankful to Aner for that. So when we come to the question of what are the most important innovations or developments in psychoanalysis today, I think we're dealing with a rather complicated question. And this is because developments in psychoanalysis aren't merely developments that are proposed by psychoanalysts, but developments of psychoanalysis, developments that are inherently psychoanalytic in nature. So we can sort of characterize, as Aner did, what psychoanalytic developments look like, but what makes them psychoanalytic in essence is one of the questions. When we apply it to other areas, as John suggests, what is that it that we are applying? Okay, that's what I would see as central here. So the question actually requires defining psychoanalysis, and as is well known, this is a highly charged and controversial topic, which I plan not to avoid. So in what follows, I'll offer a brief description of what I consider to be the essence of psychoanalysis. It addresses one of the questions that came up before. And then I'll describe what I consider in the light of this to be developments within it. And I'm talking here really about what is the content of psychoanalysis? What makes psychoanalysis and not some other therapeutic approach? And finally, I'll comment on the light of this on how what are generally regarded as analytic innovations are not really analytic innovations from my perspective. They're not analytic, they're innovations. Okay, so my view of psychoanalysis is a Kleinian one. And as Hannah described, the Kleinian approach, in my view, brings out most clearly what's essential to psychoanalysis as set forth by Freud. So I often in my writings, I refer to a Freudian Kleinian approach. I don't see it as Klein as opposed to Freud, but really that Klein brings out Freud. So in a nutshell, from this perspective, psychoanalysis offers a psychological understanding of the person and a form of therapy that is concerned with unconscious truth. And I should say, before you mentioned, oh, all the theories have unconscious, I don't think that's the case. I've heard many psychoanalysts talk about how we no longer need the unconscious in psychoanalysis. I don't think that is anymore what holds psychoanalysts together. In fact, I did a controversy on that some years ago in the journal, in the International. So from my perspective, it is concerned with unconscious truth. It proposes that the failure to know oneself, one's inner truths, is what lies at the foundation of psychic disorder. And analytic cure is to allow the patient to come to know these previously unknown unconscious truths. Or to put it more accurately, the concern of psychoanalysis is with disorder insofar as it can be understood in terms of failure to know one's unconscious truth. That's where we're focused on. Could be there's other things, other needs in life. Psychoanalysis is concerned with disorder insofar as it relates to these unconscious truths. Coming to know truth in this context is not an intellectual matter, but rather involves the integration of parts of ourselves. It means a lived experience of these parts, and it is also a motivated act, as is the failure to come to know. That is, we, in a sense, unconsciously choose to know and choose to deny. And in this sense, our psychic suffering and the suffering we cause others because of that are a result of these choices, or albeit unconscious ones. In other words, what I'm emphasizing here is that psychoanalysis provides the person with a certain way to know and be oneself, to choose to live truthfully, to own who one is and what one does. This, in turn, has therapeutic effects. For example, and notably so, when we are and own ourselves, the world becomes more real. Others become actual human beings rather than projected parts of ourselves with whom we carry on perhaps some kind of imaginary relations. Our relationships deepen. Such therapeutic benefits are a derivative of striving towards the analytic aim of an understanding. That is, psychoanalysis doesn't offer the best way towards symptom relief, but a specific path towards it, one which is inherently valuable. It provides symptom relief insofar as it's possible through the deepest integration of the patient's unconscious mind, of the truth at which at bottom he struggles with. And what is this struggle about? I think here also, this is part of the definition of psychoanalysis. What needs to be denied? It's not everything. It's certain kinds of things that psychoanalysis is concerned with. There are many sources of pain and suffering in life. There's actual losses and deprivations and injustices and environmental deficits of various kinds, but ultimately, psychoanalysis's concern, as I understand it, is not with difficulty per se. It's not with the stresses associated with life. It is concerned rather with the patient's inner world, his inner fantasies and meanings which distort reality and make life unnecessarily, unrealistically difficult, as may be seen in the depression, sense of emptiness, anxiety, obsessions, problematic relationships that our patients come to analysis with. Bad events happen, but what concerns psychoanalysis is the inner meaning of those events. Just an absent mother may mean in the patient's mind that she recognized that he's bad and therefore she left, or that she feels that she could leave him because he's so omnipotent and self-sufficient, or that the patient projected his own harmfulness into his mother, that's why she's leaving him. At the heart of the inner world that concerns psychoanalysis is a struggle between love and hate. That's another essential dimension here, as I understand it. Between the love of our objects and the hate of them. Hate because of inevitable frustrations, the existence of the third, envy, and so on. The hatred of loved objects, or the love of hated ones, our fantasies of the destruction of those we love, are unbearably painful, and so we conceal them from ourselves. The hate, or the love, or the conflict or the feelings that the conflict arouses, and especially guilt. We modify the world to fit our needs and desires. We deny reality. In a sense, we destroy it as it is, the bad as well as the goodness that it contains, in order to serve our own self-interest. And these ideas regarding what underlies our psychic well-being and disorder find different forms of expression in Freud's theories. For example, in his Oedipus complex, it's the heart of his Oedipus complex, which he said is what distinguishes psychoanalysts, disciples of psychoanalysis, from those that aren't. Why? Because this is essential to psychoanalytic thinking. It's in his theories of narcissism and sexuality, the life and death instincts, and Klein elaborates these, for example, in her depressive position, and other followers continue these ideas. It's not merely that Freud found these themes to be central and we can find other ones, but this is so basic to Freud's psychoanalytic thinking and the psychoanalytic theory that he developed that it defines what can be found. It defines what can be central. And I should add that this centrality of this struggle between love and hate also shapes the form and meaning of the integration that psychoanalysis facilitates. In this integration, in the psychoanalytic cure, not only does the person become able to more realistically see the other, it's not only, okay, now I can see reality, but also the person becomes better able to love him. Psychoanalysis frees the person's ability to love. And now finally to the analytic process, at the heart of it is the analyst's effort to facilitate the integration of these unconscious truths through allowing these truths, the inner fantasies, to come alive in relation to the analyst and for the analyst to interpret them. This, as I mentioned, it isn't an intellectual process as it's often depicted. Rather, the patient's inner world, his fantasies and unconscious drives, his idiosyncratic interpretations of reality, his hates and loves, are directed and projected at the analyst and are directly engaged in the analytic relationship. The analyst, resisting natural inclinations to defend or to submit to these projections and drives, resisting inclinations to become the good or bad objects the patient wishes to find in the analyst, that is, he maintains a neutral position, which is essential to psychoanalysis, interprets what's happening, what the patient feels the analyst is doing to him and he to her, and why. Such direct and immediate interpretation of what is going on, okay, I don't know, it'd be in the moment, something like you feel that my interpretation now was weak and unhelpful, but you enjoy that because then you feel that we'll stay together forever and I won't ever have anything that you don't already have. It's something that's happening in the moment. Is something that can immediately resonate with what's going on in the patient's unconscious mind, and in this way, open the mind to experience, and in a sense, to allow the patient to know and integrate these parts of his mind. A patient may come to feel his envy and its intrapsychic sources. He would struggle with the sense of limitation and frustration that it implies, and the sorrow and guilt for the destructiveness with which these are associated. The denied parts would become known in the sense that they would become integral to who he is and how he acts and feels in the world. Okay, so now that we know what I think psychoanalysis is, we can now take the next step and think what innovation is within this perspective. For an innovation to be relevant to my work, it would need to enrich the perspective that I've here outlined. Other things may help a person in distress or expand the patient's horizons. And I think there should be, someone shouldn't only have an analyst. It's very bad if that's all they have for their development. But the analyst provides this specific analytic help. And there have been, indeed, many important psychoanalytic innovations. This, not only within Freud repeatedly changed his views. In fact, Freud hardly ever says anything definitive. There is this kind of idea of Freud being very strict. Freud has his basic framework. But beyond that, beyond the basic framework, there is a constant evolution of his thinking. So this includes growing understanding of various kinds of unconscious fantasies and their meanings and motives, with a special focus on how these fantasies impact our thinking processes, and particularly how they do so within the analytic relationship. In this context, advances in our understanding of the fantasy of projective identification, for example, is most notable. We now better understand how, in projecting in this way, we fear retribution from the object into whom we project, or we fear losing parts of ourselves in that object, and how we do in fact lose parts of ourselves in the object. The various fantasies that we have regarding the thinking process itself have also become more elaborate. This includes fantasies of thinking as acts of digestion or of intercourse, and in turn, not thinking as attacks on linking or going into a psychic retreat. There have also been insights into how to interpret in ways that best allow for these fantasies to be grasped or integrated by the patient through growing awareness to different aspects of the here and now of the analytic process that can be interpreted, and deeper understanding of the role of the analyst countertransference within that process. Others have developed an appreciation of various specific constellations of fantasies and disorders. For example, Britton and the hysterical, and Siegel and the manic, and Joseph and the perverse, and Rosenfeld and the narcissistic. These developments are innovative in the sense that they creatively enrich and deepen our analytic understanding and practice. So from my perspective, innovation is in a sense a creative deepening of this analytic perspective. So we have the perspective and it becomes deeper and richer and more elaborate, which better helps us understand. So, and now I'll say in the analytic field in general, there have been several broad developments which I think have become accepted and I find to be very problematic. In fact, things that take psychoanalysis back to its pre-psychoanalytic period. And I mentioned 5, and I'll go through them very briefly. Neuropsychoanalysis, evidence-based psychoanalysis, the focus on environmental causes of the patient's predicaments, traumas, and early parental deficits, the postmodern intersubjective position, where there's actually no truth really to be discovered, and the adoption of an eclectic stance. I think, Hannah, I managed to disagree with everything you mentioned at the beginning at this point. But those are the 5 points, which I would say that these developments and the technical changes that they involve, in my view, don't advance. Now, why neuroscience, which is very popular these days? And I'll go through this very briefly. Learning about neuroscientific correlates of human experience can never contribute to the understanding of individual experience, the meanings the individual conveys at a given moment, the specific set of fantasies that shape his way of being. In fact, it interferes with such understanding. Just as the study of the chemistry of the paint of a work of art, without which the work of art, the painting, wouldn't exist, doesn't contribute to the understanding of the meaning of the work of art. In the same way, information regarding the neurological correlates of human experience does not allow us to understand the person on a level of psychological meaning, the level which is relevant to psychoanalysis, as I understand it. And when neuroscience is, wrongly in my view, taken seriously, it provokes generalized ways of thinking. For example, a focus on function rather than content, like a phobia. In a phobia, there's a focus on the fact that the patient has fear or is stuck in some way, rather than its specific contents, that the person is afraid of spiders, not of bees. Okay, there's no bee area in the in the brain. So we get lost in these functions rather in those very specific details. Evidence, the problem with evidence-based ideas has a similar problem. The kind of research and evidence that is sought is of a kind that it will allow for prediction. Based on this research, it might be suggested that a certain kind of intervention is likely to be helpful to a certain kind of patient, or even that certain kinds of statements or actions by the patient likely imply the presence of certain kinds of memories or ideas. This may be helpful if someone has to gamble on what something might mean, or what would bring about the greatest change. But if the analyst is there to offer analysis, there's no room for such gambling or generalization. One would simply carry out the analytic task of trying to understand and interpret based on the rich, specific, and unique details the individual patient presents. If we return to the painting analogy, it could be the case that having a lot of yellow in a painting has been found to be associated with the painting being thought to express happy themes. And I may rely on this if I had to bet on what a painting is expressing based only on information regarding its colors. But if I actually have access to the painting and could study it in detail, then this information would be irrelevant to me. It might be that in the totality of this specific painting, yellow does not at all express happiness or lead to an overall sense of it. In analogy, the generalizations of empirical research can distract the analyst from discerning what is finding expression in the individual analytic patient. Now, of course, psychoanalysis, as I practice it, too, relies on models, which have emerged on the basis of clinical experience. But these models, and I think I'm close here to what Aner said, don't inform and predict in the way that evidence-based models do. Rather, they, for example, regarding ideas on love and hate and guilt, open us to consider different ways in which what is specifically going on in the patient might be listened to. It's a frame of mind, it's a way of thinking. I turn now to the environmental causes. Clearly, who we are is shaped in part by what we have experienced, but events per se don't shape the mind. Only the meanings ascribed to them do. And psychoanalysis, as I see it, is precisely concerned with such meanings as they find expression in unconscious fantasy. And here too, it may be seen that the focus on the environmental level is potentially harmful. It takes the place of a focus on the understanding of the internal unconscious meanings. It supports projection outwardly onto external figures rather than the integration of what's projected, and is often accompanied by the analyst assuming a corrective environmental role that interferes with the interpretation of transference. Here I would emphasize that one popular contemporary corrective environmental role finds expression in a kind of late Bion approach, which speaks of the analyst dealing in various ways with unformulated experience and moving towards the O. It wasn't that it took a while for the Kleinians to accept this. The Kleinians openly don't accept this. And this clearly, from this perspective, my perspective, is not a psycho-development. It's not within that realm. It is not concerned with a struggle with inner meanings, but rather with absence of meaning due to environmental deficits, which are dealt with not through understanding of relived dynamics in interpretation, but through new intersubjective experiences. And this leads to my next point, very briefly, the postmodern intersubjective term. It's become very popular, that there is no actual objective truth to be discovered because the analytic situation is a kind of neo-creation determined by the interplay of the subjectivities of both analyst and patient. As such, it completely does away with the main aim of analysis, as I understand it, coming to know or integrating actually split off parts of the self. The last major development, the adoption of the eclectic stance, and I'll finish in 2 minutes now. I'm about to finish. opposes psychoanalysis, as I understand it, because it involves including approaches which, in my view, are not analytic. Moreover, since analytic theories describe human nature, they're not poetry, they, as Anna mentioned, they aren't the kind of thing that are true or useful for some patients some of the time, while for others, other kinds of theories apply. One can have a multifaceted Oedipal model, but one couldn't hold both the basic Freudian view of Oedipal conflict and an opposing Cohutian one, sometimes applying one and sometimes the other. Moreover, the kind of process I described is something that must be consistently applied. An analyst who sometimes chooses to actively take on idealized roles projected by the patient cannot at other times relate to the transference and interpret it in ways prescribed by my approach. In sum, in my view, the major innovations that have taken place in the analytic world, which focus on material aspects of reality, biology, general empirical evidence, trauma, or alternatively, on how reality is unknowable or exceptionally flexible, fail to actually advance psychoanalysis. On the contrary, they distance us from true analytic innovation, which, I've argued, must be aimed at understanding and knowing the meaningful struggles going on in our unconscious psychic reality and facilitating their integration through the interpretation of their transferential lived expression in the analytic setting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm not sure what exactly was you disagreed with in the beginning, but I'm sure that you were presenting a very, very, very lucid and clear, basic system that has very clear boundaries and that is really useful, I think, to anybody in terms of thinking about the essential characteristics of psychoanalytic inquiry. And although of course one can argue about whether some of the new ideas at any rate are indeed, as you are suggesting, defensive attempts to get away from psychic pain and not ways of extending our understanding psychoanalytically of contexts that are different from the contexts that were present, for example, when Freud was alive, or of contexts that indeed impact directly, not necessarily, not only through fantasy, not only through meanings, but impact directly the way a person develops. But this is, but thank you very much for articulating this very, I think, comprehensive and clear description of what psychoanalysis is from the Kleinian perspective. And we now move to a very different position. As you said, it's really great that we can move now to a very different position that will be presented by Steve Kutchuk. And I think it's really what happens in the book is this is what happens in the book as the innovations are presented or the perspectives are presented separately and in a way that allows us to see the contradictions and in a comparative, as John said, sort of a comparative way, look at the differences in understanding psychoanalytic endeavor. So our last speaker is Stephen Kutchuk, who will speak about innovations in relational psychoanalysis. Steve Kutchuk is an editor-in-chief of Psychoanalytic Perspectives. He's the co-editor of the Relational Perspective book series. He's the president of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, and a board member, supervisor, and faculty at the National Institute of Psychoanalysis. He's also faculty supervisor at the National Training Program of NIP and the Stephen Mitchell Relational Study Center and the Institute of Relational Psychoanalysis of Philadelphia, as well as other institutes. Dr. Kouchuk's writing focuses primarily on the analyst's subjectivity, and in 2015 and 2016, he won the Gradiva Award for Best Edited Books, Clinical Implications of the Psychoanalyst's Life Experience When the Personal Becomes Professional, and The Legacy of Sandor Ferenczi, From Ghost to Ancestor, co-edited with Adrian Harris. His latest book is entitled The Relational Revolution in Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, and is due out next month from Confer Books. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Chana. And thank you everyone, Aner and John, for this book and for inviting me to write, and for all of you who invited me to speak today. It's so nice for me to see so many familiar faces and friends, and I want to, okay, it's too much to wish for a handshake or a hug these days, but how about being in the same room? That might be a nice start. So hi to my friends and colleagues. The fact that John and Aner have a chapter in the book on doing telehealth is quite prescient, quite innovative. Well, we thought it was innovative. Now it's the norm. So that really makes this book current and interesting. I had forgotten that chapter was in there. So what did you guys know? There's that question I have. I'm not sure that I agree. John mentioned the book is comparative rather than integrative. Yes, technically. So I'll tell you what your book is. No, technically it's comparative, but the fact that our theories are all there, or as Rachel says, perhaps in her chapter, what psychoanalysis is from a Kleinian perspective is there, I think begins to bring us towards some possibility for integration, maybe, right? Having the chapters laid out the way they are. And I keep thinking about Stephen Cooper's concept of bridge theory that talks about the fact that so much psychoanalytic theory in today's world actually crosses over various theoretical schools. And I see some of that in your book as well, in these chapters. And even listening to Rachel, as much of a difference as there is in your interpretation of Klein and my interpretation of relational psychoanalysis, I see some overlap. And certainly in the contemporary Freudian school, we see a lot of concepts that I would say probably started with relationalists, but the interpersonalists would say it started with them, and the Freudians might say it started with them. But at any rate, we speak some interesting overlapping languages in psychoanalysis, as you all know. So speaking of language, I start the chapter in a way that I want to begin to speak to you right now. And first of all, I have to say a couple of hours on a Zoom book launch is a lot. So thank you for still being here and listening. And these talks have been fascinating to me. And such four very different perspectives and different pieces of a whole, really interesting. There's a problem in relational psychoanalysis with semantics. John and I have written that to each other or in response to each other. And in publications, but also in our correspondence, there's a big problem with semantics. What are you supposed to do with a way of thinking that uses the same word for relational as it uses for relational? So what are you going to do with that listening to this right now? It's a big problem, right? So Steve Mitchell uses the word for the first time in talking about psychoanalysis in 1983 with Jay Greenberg, of course. And he refers to relational psychoanalysis as a grouping, as you know, a grouping of interpersonal, self-psych, object relations theories. I'm sure I'm missing something, but he's using relational in that way. 5 years later, writing on his own, he uses the same word, relational, to talk about, we can argue and have a whole separate seminar together on is relational psychoanalysis, as Mitchell then talked about it in '88. Is it a theory, a school of thought within psychoanalysis, a turn, a perspective, an idea? At any rate, Mitchell goes and uses the same word, relational psychoanalysis, to mean something different, right? To mean some specific ways of thinking about analytic work, to think about what the unconscious means. I would not agree that postmodern theory, at least as the relationalists understand it, means a dismissal of the unconscious or a dismissal of truth. We see it differently. We want to understand one's feelings about truth, what truth means, whose truth. Does the analyst get to say, we're going to discover what's true and make the unconscious conscious? Does the patient get to say it? Whose truth? But at any rate, Mitchell is using the same word for both phenomena. What came to be known as small r relational psychoanalysis, interpersonal object relations, self-psychology, and other ways of thinking, and big R. The problem is most writers starting in the 80s to this day don't differentiate. So unless you're really steeped in psychoanalysis and know who you're reading, if you're reading Jody Davies and many others, if you're reading Lou Aaron, you know that they're probably talking about big R, relational psychoanalysis. Listen, this brings us to more semantic problems in postmodern psychoanalysis. What do we mean by intersubjectivity? The word it's different if you listen to Jessica or Benjamin or Lou or Stollerow. Stollerow's not even talking about intersubjectivity necessarily. He may be talking about intersubjective systems theory as a separate orientation, as we see in the book, etc. So I think in the postmodern world, maybe in psychoanalysis over the course of time, but certainly in the postmodern world, in the contemporary world, there's a problem with semantics. So it's hard for me to talk about innovative movements within relational psychoanalysis without first talking about what I think might need to be some kind of pedagogical innovation, to go back to the beginning of relational theory and clarify what do we mean with this word? What do we mean with the word? Once we go there, we have another problem, which is, and I think I say this in the chapter too, relational psychoanalysis, and I'm using the word now as big R, relational psychoanalysis is probably the only orientation within psychoanalysis that was not founded by one person. I think we could probably agree on this, or mostly agree on this. Obviously, Steve Mitchell introduced us to the word and some of the ideas he had, but right away, he brought in Jody Davies, Phil Bromberg, Lou Aaron, Jessica Benjamin, Manny Gent, a whole list of first generation relational analysts to help create this way of thinking with him. So the fact that he brought in multiple voices during the defining days of big R relational work, and the fact that he was trying to differentiate himself from previous schools of psychoanalysis, where you have more of a one-size-fits-all, more of what we might call a traditional theory. I might turn to John and Aner to ask them if they would agree with this, given their philosophical orientation towards thinking about what is a theory. But the fact that Mitchell was trying to distance himself from older ways of thinking about theory, the fact that relational psychoanalysis was developed not by one person, but by many, and the fact that each of us would probably define relational psychoanalysis differently today makes it very difficult to define, very difficult to teach, and very difficult to study unless we achieve some level of comfort with the fact that it's really in many ways a melting pot and a diverse set of perspectives, which I don't see as being as defining a characteristic of our other orientations within psychoanalysis. Most, if not all of which, by the way, I incorporate in my identity as an analyst. I was trained classically as a classical Freudian, and I do incorporate object relations and Kleinian and all the other schools of thought. But that's the big tent that I think Hannah referenced that relational allows for. So what's innovative? What's innovative in relational psychoanalysis? First, I hope we can agree on what relational is to some extent. That's my attempt, by differentiating between little r and big R and pointing to some of the semantic problems. What's innovative? I would say, and I'm skipping over here, what big R relational is in terms of a melding of object relations and class. I was going to say classical Freudian, not according to Mitchell, maybe Greenberg, but certainly object relations and interpersonal, et cetera. But from the beginning, relational psychoanalysis is, as you know, also incorporated feminism, also incorporated queer studies, also incorporated general sociocultural issues. I think that's why you see some integration, to go back to what Gabby mentioned, Gabby Mann, I think that's why you see some integration of relational work and Buddhism. There's space for a lot to come into this big tent. And relational psychoanalysis situated itself from 1988, when Mitchell first talks about big R relational, situated itself as a form of analytic thinking that was going to incorporate everyday difficulties and issues and struggles. Neil Altman's work in this area obviously focuses on these elements of relational psychoanalysis. So we're looking at things that other forms of psychoanalysis said are distractions, We're looking at the environment. We're looking at external systems. I would say all of this is innovative. It's been with us, this way of thinking about psychoanalytic development and treatment has been with us since the mid to late 80s. But I would say it's still innovative when held in dialectical tension with other ways of thinking about analytic work. And it's shifting because society shifts and culture shifts. So I wrote my chapter before the George Floyd murder here in the US and before the revival of the Black Lives Matter movement. I was actually nervous to go back to my chapter. I was afraid, what if I didn't talk about race? What if I didn't talk about some of this? Thank goodness it was already brewing within psychoanalysis in general and within relational psychoanalysis, a greater awareness of race, diversity, economic struggle. Relational psychoanalysis turns our attention to all of these aspects of development and functioning. Relational psychoanalysis suggests that the clinician must keep these factors in mind. This is certainly not how I was trained as a more classical thinker. Although perhaps if I came into Freudian training today, there'd be more space for this. In fact, it was the Freudians who contributed very largely to the Black Analysts Speak videos in part. But relational psychoanalysis is very well positioned to consider sociocultural and political issues. And I would say that's innovative in psychoanalysis. And rather than detract from whatever purity of analytic depth and transference, countertransference dynamics we've been taught from the beginning of analytic time we must pursue, I would say that most relationalists would probably argue that considering these sociocultural factors and larger systems issues deepens our understanding of what it means to be human. Now, I think that John and Anair spoke to this, maybe others of you did as well, but certainly certainly innovation can only exist. I think actually, Anir, I think you spoke to this quite a bit. Innovation can only exist by, my words at this point, standing on the shoulders of that which has come before. So from the beginning of relational analytic time, there has been a great interest in the person of the therapist. Who is the clinician? Who is the clinician as a human? What has her life involved in terms of crisis and challenge and strengths, et cetera? Who is the person? Who is the analyst coming into the room and working with the patient? How is that going to affect the transference? In fact, how do we even say where the countertransference begins if we consider the question of who is the analyst as a person? So this was something that Mitchell was working with from the beginning, and his colleagues invited in were working with from the beginning. And many of you know that it's a particular area of interest for me. So when I think about the analyst's subjectivity, again, I would say there is something innovative about considering the analyst as a person. And I would say a lot of that consideration has become part of bridge theory, what Cooper calls bridge theory, and is very much a part of how contemporary Freudians and others think about psychoanalysis. But I also think about the analyst's subjectivity in concert with concepts of self-disclosure. What do our patients learn about us? What do they know about us? How do we differentiate between inadvertent disclosures versus deliberate disclosures? And how do we respect, I think all schools of thought perhaps would agree with this, but how do we respect a patient's right not to know about us? Rachel used the word neutrality. I think most relationalists would assume that's not quite an achievable concept yet. That's quite a difference between how some of the postmodern thinkers consider the work versus more traditional ways of approaching the work. But if we think about neutrality as, even if it's an abstraction in the relationalist's mind, if we think about it as an absolute, and we think about one critique of relational psychoanalysis being relational psychoanalysts just want to talk about themselves and they just self-disclose and they only look at the here and now and not the intrapsychic or the unconscious. If we look at that, what I would say distorted image or exaggeration of what relational psychoanalysis is meant to be, even if each of us defines it differently, we have to wonder if there's some room to make space for the person of the analyst, the inadvertent influence and impact on the transference field that the person of the analyst will have. We have to look at selective deliberate disclosure as an option to be used judiciously, but as part of the therapeutic action potentially. And we have to look at protecting our patient's right not to know things about us. How do we handle all of this? One thought that I've had about this is that I do believe that working analytically, here's my take on what is analysis, if I can put aside my relational identity for a moment. One thing that I would say I understand about psychoanalysis is that it's a mostly interior private process, right? Robert Grossmark talks about the unobtrusive relational analyst, the importance of respecting a patient's privacy and private space. I think that a lot of the work that becomes healing ultimately involves the analyst's interior space and the patient's interior space. How do we make room for that way of thinking, but also consider things like deliberate self-disclosure, the analyst's subjectivity as an inadvertent part of the treatment field, et cetera? There's something that I call silent disclosure. It's a way that I have of thinking about some of what we probably need to do. What happens when we try on a disclosure? something that we might decide to share with the patient about ourselves, about our impressions of a patient. What happens when we try that on silently, when we speak the words to ourselves? Where does that lead us? I would argue that silent disclosures take us in the direction of reclaiming otherwise dissociated content, our own feelings, our own thoughts, our own fantasies, our countertransference, if we want to use that word, or the patient's projections, the patient's projected material that they perhaps have split off, that we're picking up on in the field. A silent disclosure suddenly allows us to make some space for ourselves in the room so that we don't succumb to absolute dissociation, boredom, overwhelm of affect, etc. And this is one concept that I use to attempt to bridge the gap between making explicit room for ourselves in the office versus silence and so-called neutrality, I'd have to put in quotes, on the other end of the spectrum. And I write in this chapter of a very brief example, which I'm going to give you now, clinical example, which I'll give you now.
We need to be brief because I'd like to have a few moments to wrap up. And
Sure. So actually, in lieu of giving you the clinical example, you can buy the book, buy extra copies of the book even, and read the clinical example. You're welcome, John. And but let me say that I think there are ways that the relational analyst is looking more and more lately at how they consider the question of who is the analyst as a person, how do we respect the patient's need for interiority and private contemplation without the analyst being impinging, and how do we look at the whole field in terms of external systems, biopsychosocial stressors, etc. This is what I'm going to end with instead of the clinical example. What I'm going to end with is two books that Lou and Joyce Slockower and Sue Grand edited in 2018, De-idealizing relational psychoanalysis and decentering relational psychoanalysis. This is the innovative note that I'll leave you on in terms of my talk right now. These books are the first attempt at critiquing a school of thought within psychoanalysis by the adherents to that school of thought. So both of these volumes have chapters by relational authors who are saying, you know what? We ask patients to self-critique. Why are analysts of any orientation not self-critiquing? Why are analysts of any school of thought not subjecting their own theories to vigorous investigation? Why do we leave it up to John and Anner and other philosophers within psychoanalysis to critique relational, object, classical, on and on and on? And these books, I think, are somewhat revolutionary in much the way that relational psychoanalysis was considered revolutionary 20 years ago when it first came up, 30 years ago now. And so I would say the whole idea of self-critique as a way of deepening one's understanding of the limitations of one's theory base is something that probably all psychoanalysts could benefit from and that relationalists could probably go further with as well. So much that's innovative happening in our field across all of the schools, but that's my thought about relational. Thank you.
thank you very much, Steve. We have a few more minutes, and I'd like to ask the other contributors, maybe particularly Anner and John, to respond or to summarize or to say whatever you want to add to the discussion.
Well, I was really impressed by both, both of the talks, because I can identify with basically everything that everybody's saying. It's just what perspective or what form of identifications you could find yourself in, whether it be as a clinician or whether it be as a theorist. And I won't take up very much time, but I couldn't help but for Raquel's, she's talking about unconscious truth. And so I'll forego the question, what do you mean by truth? But the notion that we honestly have to look at our interior and accept the reality of that interior is exactly what the ancients were talking about. She could be Plato, the first psychoanalyst. We're talking about know thyself. And yet at the same time, how do you address something like the fact that we have the desire not to know? We don't want to know everything because it's so painful, and hence you have an inner divide in the psyche. A part of you has to accept what it is in yourself, but also to discount the external world would limit the field of the analytic encounter. And so the parameters of where she's coming from, I can understand. Unfortunately, I don't have people coming to me who are interested in that. They aren't the type that are in formal psychoanalysis. So I fall more on the side of Steve, that there's a relational craving that people have, and they want to relate to me in ways that are authentic, but at the same time, I'm hindered by my role. What is my role? I have to navigate the terrain, and I have to wear different hats at different times, and everybody has different needs, developmental histories, wishes and fantasies and desires, and yet I can't be just myself like I am right now. So anyway, I really appreciate hearing both really evocative perspectives that are both represented in the book, and this just goes to show you how we can, exist with a sense of diversity and appreciation for other people's points of view.
Thank you, John. Anir, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I just want to say that these were two fascinating discussions by Rachel and Steve. And I think that you cannot imagine two more opposite and contrast schools than Rachel and Steve. And that actually, I know Rachel won't agree with me, that actually this is what I like about psychoanalysis, because it's so diverse and there are so many voices in there. And I think if we think what is the basis, what lies behind their difference, it's a very different concept of truth. I would guess that Rachel has more a correspondent theory of truth. She's like thinking that if you say something, it must correspond to something there out there in reality, while Steve has a very much more pluralistic and hermeneutic and postmodern affinities, and he can hold many different truths. And I think the correspondent theory of truth is less, it's hard for it to tolerate different truth than the more pluralistic concept of truth. In a sense, the relational approach is more close to Freud in the sense that Freud was very open to different bodies of knowledge, to what happened in psychology outside psychoanalysis, and in perception, and in philosophy, and in brain research. And Freud incorporated all these findings to his theory. And he was very curious about what happens out there in the world, and how he can use it for his own theory. And I think you can find this openness and curiosity more in the relational approach, while the Kleinian approach, they tend to imply the Kleinian theory on different fields of knowledge, or different bodies of knowledge outside, but they less tend to be influenced by the outside world.
But you know what? It gets so complicated, as we all know. So I have my self states. to use a relational term, in which I probably do adhere more to a kind of correspondent truth. You know, it's which of our states, I might say, which of our states are being triggered in various moments as we're thinking about theory and as we're working with a particular patient whose own states are being revived. Although on the whole, I would, yes, what you're saying resonates for me. Yeah.
Noga is writing that relationalists try to keep in mind otherness, of course, and mutual vulnerability as part of the diet, which we should really mention. And I think, as you said very beautifully, Steve, there is a very serious consideration of the culture that surrounds us as something that is unconsciously influencing the diet and influencing what's happening in the interaction.
If I may comment,
I'm also interested in the culture. Yeah. Okay.
If I may comment, you know, when we talk about these different approaches and different theories, I should say I couldn't find in what Steve said what defines psychoanalysis. I understand psychoanalysis also opens to culture, also has a broad tent, also does all these other kind of things, also is open to vulnerability. But what is, or when Hannah said, but we psychoanalytically understand, what is this psychoanalysis that's in this psychoanalytic understanding which we apply in other contexts?
We need volume two, Rachel. We need volume two. Debates.
Psychoanalysis doesn't discount the external world. It pays great attention to it. It doesn't discount the other, but it has a specific concern. And this concern was in Freud. Freud, when he was talking about the role of biology, of course he knew biology well, but he said that biology is important to the psychoanalyst as the material that the telescope makes to the astronomer. You're looking out, you know, the microscope, what the microscope is made out of isn't important. And this kind of awareness is central to Kleinian thinking. In my view, it advances Freud's thinking. It doesn't discount the external, but it has something that's called psychoanalysis. It is a specific thing. It's not, when you say, and I use my analytic understanding in this way and that way, the question is, who are you excluding? Who doesn't belong to your camp? And no one wants to say that. It's also an additional and applied, but who is left out of this game? And I think that's what's important to define. Who doesn't belong? Where are you setting the line of division?
Well, you know, it's a big, you know, I did not address in my chapter, what do I think psychoanalysis is, but you want to ask 5 relationalists, you might get 5 answers. And I would say that this enriches, I don't know that it has to.
Or points to confusion.
Let me
points to confusion. It either enriches or confuses.
More opportunities for learning and deepening. And I think that a lot of relationalists would probably, and I would probably agree with you, that the unconscious has a hugely important place, as does transference. Countertransference, I might not agree where transference, countertransference starts. Is it with the patient or the analyst? But I think we probably have a lot of ground that we would include. But I'm not as interested in defining what is psychoanalysis. I'm interested in how do each of us practice? How do each of us deepen our patients' psychic life and external lives?
Maybe then what you're doing isn't, if you're not interested in defining it, then maybe what you're doing isn't psychoanalysis.
I highly doubt that.
No, but why?
We'll have to agree. That's for another day, it seems.
No, my question is, what makes what you do psychoanalysis? Okay, that's the question.
I think you made your point very clearly, Rachel, and very persuasively. But there are differences here, and I think as in in, for example, plastic art, I don't think I need to decide whether Rembrandt is art or Duchamp is art. They have both a place, and they still are ways of expressing artistically something. And I think similarly, I can think of psychoanalysis where your conception is really, it's very persuasive and it's very strong, but it's really one way, and the diversity which allows additional ways of thinking about it, still maintaining the basic structure. I'm very convinced by what you said, Amir, about the basic structure of linking psychopathology with the transference and development. Whether we talk about trauma, whether we talk about universal drives, but the structure that links those, and the way we link those, for me, defines psychoanalysis in many ways. But thank you, everybody, very much. Somebody's writing, thank you, Steve, for inspiring clear words and all the other contributions to this interesting conference. And thanks to Hannah. And thank you. Some points will stay with me for reflection. And I think we need to differentiate conscious truth, what we know, and unconscious truth. Michal is writing. And so forth. So I think we can end here. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to all our presenters. Thank you, Anna and John, for the book. Thank you, Rachel and Steve, for articulating your positions so complexly and so clearly. And thanks, everybody, for being here. Somebody is writing superb symposium in every way. Congratulations to all. So congratulations.
Thank you, Dana, everybody. Thanks.
And good night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.